Welcome to the Q Podcast.
Q is about conversation.
If we're really concerned about ending poverty, we've got to be more concerned about creating justice.
Our cultural products as Christians need to both defy and resonate with the culture.
But God's doing amazing things. His church is expanding. His church is growing.
It's not what's the purpose of my life, it's what is the purpose that's been assigned.
Stay curious, think well, advance good. This is Q.
Welcome to another edition of the Q Podcast. I'm Gabe Lyons, and today we're talking about the word privilege. Now, this is a word that really has always been a part of our lexicon, but you look at the last 3 or 4 years, there's been a lot more discussion about this idea of what is privilege. Sometimes it's tied to the idea of white privilege, but it's the idea of what is privilege and how do you use privilege to benefit others? Is privilege a bad thing? How should we think about privilege? How do we enter into this conversation if it's one where you're thinking, hey, what's wrong with privilege? This is going to be one of those talks that I know challenges you and helps you think through that. It's called The Harm of Privilege. It was delivered by Amy Julia Becker. Amy Julia Becker's been around Q for a very long time, an incredible author, bestseller. She's a speaker, but what I love about Amy Julia and her husband and family is they're just amazing, number one. Number two, they have a daughter that has Down syndrome. And those of you who know me and have been around me, I now have 2 children with Down syndrome. And we just got to know them. And she has written some amazing books about just her journey with her daughter. And to see her come around this particular topic and to think through what does this mean? She lives in the Northeast. She's very vulnerable about her own growing up in privilege and what she's learned as time's gone forward, as she's lived out her life, and asking us really what responsibilities come with privilege. So if you're listening to this podcast, I'm not sure what setting you're in, what country you're in, but let's all just imagine for a minute, we do have privileges. There's unique privileges each of us carry. Now, how do we carry the responsibilities that come with that well? Let's listen in now.
I grew up in a small and functionally segregated town in eastern North Carolina in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Caroline was an African-American woman in our town who worked in our home most days. And if I thought anything about that arrangement, it was simply that I loved her and she loved me, and I was grateful for that. We moved to Connecticut when I was 10 years old, and my family stayed in touch with Caroline over those years. And many years later, Caroline was on the phone with my dad, and she asked whether he might be willing to send her some money so that she could buy some glasses. She said she had stopped going to school when she was 6 years old, and in her retirement, she had decided she wanted to learn how to read. When I first heard that story from my dad, I thought it was beautiful because it spoke to Caroline's perseverance and tenacity and to my dad's graciousness and generosity and to the trust and respect that had built up between them. And then I saw myself as a child, getting off the school bus and walking into my home with Caroline there to greet me and climbing into a chair in our living room with my nose in a book, which is what I did almost every day. And that same story that had been beautiful became tragic to me because she had been denied one of the things that I loved and that was deserved by her. It was a moment we now call waking up to privilege, to my own position as a white woman with educated and married parents and affluence and opportunity, waking up to the harm of exclusion of a person I loved being kept from what she deserved as someone growing up in this country. And we've seen in our country, especially among white people and white Christians, a sense of waking up to that harm of exclusion, whether that's in just our history, in our legal system, in our housing, in our education. We've been waking up to that harm. But then, 13 years ago, our daughter Penny was born. And Penny, too, was born into privilege. She was born into whiteness and wealth and affluence and education and married parents. And she also was born into exclusion because, as Gabe mentioned, she was diagnosed with Down syndrome right after she was born. And so at first, I thought my job as her mom was to get her included, was to get her into the center, was to get her to really know that privilege that she had. But over time, as I came to know Penny and as I came to know other people with intellectual disabilities, what I started to see was that there was harm happening in my culture of privilege. Not just the harm of exclusion, but the harm of a culture that says, I need to prove my worth as an individual. I need to achieve. I need to keep up appearances. I need to get it right all the time because my worth comes from what I do and from what I achieve. Penny and other people I knew with intellectual disabilities were showing me a way to live that had to do with love and with community and with not productivity, but people. And I wanted that. And I began to see that in my community of whiteness and of affluence, there were rates of anxiety and substance abuse and depression that were the same, if not greater, than the general population. I started to see that privilege in and of itself was isolating and that privilege harmed those who were excluded from it, as well as those who were in the center of it. The good news is that we as a culture, I think, are waking up to this harm. And the good news for those of us who are followers of Jesus is that Jesus shows us a way towards healing. In Mark chapter 5, there's a short story of a woman who has been bleeding for 12 years. And she approaches Jesus and she reaches out for healing, but she wants to stay anonymous. She's destitute, she's suffering, she's poor. She reaches out for healing, and Jesus is not content for that healing to simply be a physical cure of her problem. And he insists on finding her. And he comes and he looks at her face to face and he says, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." And there's so much happening in that little moment because what Jesus is doing is he's saying healing is not just about fixing the problem. Healing is about restoring this woman to herself before God, her dignity and her worth, daughter, but also restoring her publicly. She was an unclean woman. She'd been bleeding for 12 years, and Jesus says to everyone around, welcome her back now. He's healing community. He's healing the religious community. He's healing her social situation, and not just her as an individual. He also says to her, your faith has healed you, which is so weird because we know it's his power that healed her. But what he's saying is, you are not a passive recipient of my healing. You are an active participant in it. And Jesus does all of this with Jairus watching on. Jairus, we know, is a man and he has a name. So in those ways, he's already very different from this woman. But Jairus has also come to Jesus for healing. The other thing we know about Jairus, which Mark mentions 3 times, and in the Bible, that's kind of like underlining and starring and circling something. He mentions 3 times that Jairus is the synagogue ruler. So here we have the synagogue ruler, the leader of the religious community, the one who presumably had told this woman, you can't be here with us. He's witnessing this healing and this restoration. And we might expect that Jesus is going to rebuke Jairus because Jesus is on the side of the powerless. He's on the side of the marginalized. He's on the side of the oppressed. And what we see instead is that Jesus is there to heal Jairus too. Jesus is there to heal the powerless and the powerful, to heal the privileged and the marginalized. I mentioned that town where I grew up in North Carolina, and I've been in touch with a woman there named Missy. She's a white woman in her late 60s, and a couple of years ago, she became concerned about the violence in their town after a young African-American boy was shot and killed. And she was out on the playground one day, and she introduced herself to a Black woman named Tanya, and they were pushing their children and grandchildren on the swing together, and Missy said, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And the next day, she got a letter from Tanya, and it said, here's what you can do. And Missy said, I'm not an activist. And so she took that letter and she put it in the bottom of a pile of papers and she ignored it for as long as she could. But eventually she took that letter out and she did the first thing, which was call the chief of police. And now, a few years later, Missy and Tanya, together in conjunction with the chief of police in their town, have gathered a group of Black and white women and men to pray. They pray once a month in various parts of their town for protection against violence and for healing of their community. And they've started to talk about a prison reentry program, and they've started to talk about school reform, and they've started to come together as friends and as brothers and sisters in Christ to see healing in their town. We see a pattern in that story in Mark 5, and we see a pattern in that little example of a town in North Carolina of people who are acknowledging harm, being willing to admit the harm that has been done and confess it, and then people who reach out for help to Jesus, for help to one another, and then who say, yeah, I'm going to participate in healing. And that's the invitation for all of us, no matter where we are, as individuals, as institutions, north, south, local communities, schools, churches, to acknowledge the harm that has been done and to confess it, to reach out for help, and then to do the messy, slow, and loving work of God's healing, participating in God's healing in a broken world. Thank you.
Well, as always, I hope you were not only challenged by that, but inspired to think about how are you going to be responsible with any of the privilege that you've been given. And I also want to invite you, if you like this talk, if we don't all love being challenged all the time, but I tell you what, when you come to a Q conference, that's what happens. 35 to 40 talks every year. April 22nd to 24th is the next one. As the year starts to wind down, we offer a Christmas special. So if you've ever been to Q or never been to Q, this is your moment to make the decision to come be with us. Come gather with people who are thinking about these kinds of topics, trying to wrestle with them and figure out, how does it apply to my life, my organization, my institution, my church, my family, my neighborhood, my city, my community. We want to apply the things that we're learning, and you do that best in person, not just from listening to the podcast, not just consuming content, but by being with other people who are creating, who are thinking about, how does this manifest in our culture today? And when you make the decision to do that, we offer one of my favorite things, the Christmas bundle, every year. And this one is the best one we've ever had. We have 6 items in it, starting with this beautiful big blanket by Sackcloth and Ashes, a cotton tempo blanket. Go Google that, cotton tempo blanket, or go to qideas.org/2020. And you'll actually see what this looks like. But a beautiful blanket for you to enjoy. You know, in this time of year, one of my favorite things to listen to is Behold the Lamb of God. It's a Christmas record that takes you from the Old Testament through the birth of Jesus in music. It's a beautiful thing by artist Andrew Peterson. We also have coffee for you. We have a black on black Q hat with the Q logo in it. It's pretty simple, sophisticated. I think you'll like it. And we also have Otterbox, who gave us just this wonderful tumbler. This thing's worth a lot of money. Keeps every item cold for many, many hours, and also fits in that cup holder perfectly. And then we have a liturgical year planner for 2020 called Sacred Ordinary Days that we want you to have, because we want you to be intentional for the year ahead. As you start planning ahead for your year, how can you make sure every day has rhythms in it that's helping you live, helping you rest, helping you stop, helping you pray, helping you just be right on point with what God has for you. So anyway, we give you all these gifts when you buy 2 tickets or more to Q 2020. This is going to be our largest Q yet. It continues to gain momentum. It takes place in Nashville, downtown, Music City Center. We're creating experiences. We're partnering with Sundance this year. The executive director of Sundance is going to be with us at Q, featuring several films and short films. We're talking about how faith intersects with film. We're going to have musicians and artists, amazing dinners and meals. I mean, talks, conversations, Q&As, breakouts, you name it, it's happening. We're trying to create the space where you can actually talk about these ideas with other thoughtful Christians who care a lot about how is our faith going forward, especially in a season where a lot of people are pretty skeptical about faith, and they're specifically skeptical about Christianity. So how are we going to be different? How are we going to model the truth and the faithfulness of what Christ has called us to be in this culture, but also walk forward informed, smart, understanding, and discerning about how can hope and joy and love show up in a culture where so many people have so many questions and aren't necessarily getting the answers from the church that they need. And so join us at Q 2020, April 22nd and 24. Invite some friends, invite somebody from across the country you don't get to see much, have them meet you there, but take advantage of this and learn more at qideas.org/2020. And I hope to see you there.